Hi, this is Lane8492. This is the only true crime story video I'll be doing this evening. This is out of the case of Florida death row inmate Bryan Frederick Jennings. You see, Bryan Frederick Jennings was convicted in the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of 6-year-old Rebecca Lynn Kunash, which was back in 1979 in Merritt Island in Brevard County, Florida. You see, at that time, Bryan Frederick Jennings, who was 20 years old, was serving in the United States Marines. See, the 6-year-old girl, Rebecca Lynn Kunash, she was apparently abducted from inside her own home in Brevard County, Florida, by Bryan Frederick Jennings, where he took her to Merritt Island, where he essayed her and then threw her head to the ground, cracking her skull, and then he drowned her in the canal in Merritt Island. Apparently, when that happened, Rebecca Lynn Kunash was asleep in her bedroom at her home when she was abducted, when Bryan Frederick Jennings broke into her bedroom. And sometime after she was reported missing, her body was found inside that canal where Bryan Frederick Jennings had apparently unalived her. That same day, Bryan Frederick Jennings was arrested for a traffic offense in Orange County, Florida, the county of Orlando. And the police were able to connect him to the abduction, violation, and brutal murder of 6-year-old Rebecca Lynn Kunash. Jennings initially denied that he was responsible for the crime, but eventually, during his interrogation, Bryan Frederick Jennings eventually confessed to the crime. And as a result, Bryan Frederick Jennings was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape. And as a result, he went on trial for it in Brevard County, Florida. His confession which was taped, was also admitted into evidence in court. And being that he did not confess under duress. Now, if he had confessed under duress, that confession would have been ruled inadmissible. But after they found no evidence that he confessed against his will, it would be admitted into evidence. And in February of 1980, Bryan Frederick Jennings went on trial for this crime. A crime like this is every parent's worst nightmare. And of course, we're all familiar with the Amber Alert. So if this happened today, it would be an Amber Alert, named after Amber Hagerman back in Texas. I remember when Amber Hagerman made headlines. I was 16 years old, and a situation like this is every parent's worst nightmare. No parent would ever want to endure that, losing a child like that to some maniac who just does that. And a former cellmate had testified that Jennings had bragged about the crime, that he broke into the house and abducted Rebecca Lynn Kunash. And the psychiatrist testified that Bryan Frederick Jennings was mentally competent and he was not insane. But apparently that psychiatrist did testify that Bryan Frederick Jennings had a predatory character and a flawed conscience. And on February 7th, 1980, Bryan Frederick Jennings was found guilty of the abduction, essay, and murder of 6-year-old Rebecca Lynn Kunash. The jury recommended the death penalty by a vote of 11-1. And as a result, on May 7th, 1980, Bryan Frederick Jennings was sentenced to die in Florida's electric chair, which was the method of execution at the time. But as I said in one video, the last time Florida used the electric chair was in 1989 of Alan Lee Davis. And I did a true crime video on him many months ago this year. Bryan Frederick Jennings was given a retrial on April 8th of 1982 due to a procedural error. And the retrial took place before a different jury in July of 1982. And Kunash's parents came into court as witnesses, reportedly expressed that the retrial reopened their wounds and brought back the pain of losing their daughter. Again, on July 15th, 1982, Bryan Frederick Jennings was again found guilty of the murder of Rebecca Lynn Kunash and sentenced to death. This time by a majority of 9-3. And it was in 1984 that the Supreme Court rejected it. And then in 1985, Bryan Frederick Jennings got another trial on the grounds that his first retrial contained errors. Prior to the retrial, Jennings' lawyers tried to seek court suppression of some evidence, claiming that it was illegally obtained. And on March 24th, 1986, Bryan Frederick Jennings stood trial for the third time. And on April 8th, 1986, the jury recommended 11-1 that Bryan Frederick Jennings be sentenced to death. And on April 25th, 1986, the circuit court judge, Charles Harris, sentenced Bryan Frederick Jennings to death again. And on August 27th, 1987, the Florida Supreme Court dismissed his appeal. Then in 2001, his sixth appeal was dismissed. And then his appeal was dismissed in September of 2005. Then the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals denied his appeal in July 3rd, 2007. And finally, on March 31st, 2008, the Supreme Court of the United States dismissed Bryan Frederick Jennings' final appeal. And now, Bryan Frederick Jennings is set for execution on November 13th of this year. And his execution will take place at the Florida State Prison in Starke, Florida. But this story is probably what contributes to every parent's worst nightmare of losing a child asleep in their own home and some predator breaks in and abducts them. And sadly, that child ends up dying for it. It's every parent's worst nightmare, and no parent should ever have to ever go through that. And now justice will finally be served to the family of 6-year-old Rebecca Lynn Kunash when Bryan Frederick Jennings' sentence is carried out on November 13th of this year. This is Lane 8492. I have an associate's, bachelor's, and master's degree in criminal justice. Hope you enjoy this video and let me know what you think. Thanks.